Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a surprisingly fascinating question. Why would someone with ADHD have been far more successful in Viking society than in today's world? So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice isn't the cold, it's the noise. Long before you've opened your eyes, someone is already splitting firewood outside. Sheep are loudly protesting the existence of mornings. A baby is crying somewhere across the longhouse. An old man is coughing with the determination of someone who survived 7 winters entirely out of spite. And in the middle of it all, the fire crackles away, filling the room with the comforting smell of smoke, damp wool, and yesterday's stew. The stew, incidentally, is also today's breakfast. Vikings believed in reducing food waste, mostly by refusing to admit anything had actually gone bad. Welcome to Scandinavia, around the year 900. As you sit up on your pile of animal furs, carefully avoiding stepping on the family dog, or possibly a wolf that everyone has simply agreed to trust, you realise something unusual. Nobody seems to know what today will bring. Not because they're disorganised, because that's simply how life works here. You may wake up intending to repair a fence, only for your neighbour to burst through the door announcing that several sheep escaped during the night. Before you've even found your boots, you're hiking through wet hillsides trying to convince livestock that returning home is somehow in their best interests. Spoiler alert, the sheep are unconvinced. By midday, just as you think you're finally getting back to work, a merchant's ship appears in the fjord carrying amber, silver, strange fabrics, and enough gossip to power the entire village for the next month. Suddenly, everyone wants to know who's getting married, who's starting another blood feud, and whether Denmark is still being, well, Denmark. By evening, dark clouds gather over the mountains. Roof repairs are abandoned. Fishing nets come out instead. Someone announces that tomorrow's weather will be perfect for sailing. Nobody asks how they know. They simply squint at the sky for a few seconds and nod confidently. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes everyone gets soaked. Modern life often rewards routine. You wake up at the same hour, drive the same road, sit at the same desk, attend the same meetings. Listen to one person explain something that could have been an email. Vikings had a refreshingly different approach. If your meeting lasted an hour, someone was probably trying to negotiate peace before the axes came out. Their calendar wasn't divided by office quarters or productivity goals. It was divided by survival. Spring meant repairing boats damaged by winter storms, preparing fields, and hoping the livestock hadn't spent the cold season inventing new ways to escape. Summer transformed the coastline into a highway. Ships left for fishing, trading, exploration, or the occasional raid, depending on everyone's mood and whether England looked particularly wealthy that year. Autumn became a race against time. Every crop had to be harvested, every animal prepared, every storehouse filled, because winter wasn't interested in hearing excuses. Then winter arrived, and life slowed, but never stopped. Tools needed repairing, clothes needed mending, children needed entertaining. Stories became the evening's television, except if someone spoiled the ending, they were probably related to the storyteller anyway. Even nature refused to cooperate with your plans. A calm sea could become dangerous before lunch. Fog swallowed familiar paths. Ice blocked rivers you'd crossed 100 times before. One storm could undo weeks of work. Living here meant constantly noticing change. The direction of the wind, the behaviour of birds, the smell of rain, the sound of distant waves. Your attention was expected to move. In fact, ignoring your surroundings was often a much bigger problem than paying attention to too many things at once. And that brings us to the curious question at the heart of tonight's story. Because while today's world often rewards sitting still, following schedules, answering emails, and pretending you're definitely listening during the 7th Zoom meeting of the week, Viking society demanded something entirely different. It rewarded people who adapted quickly, people who noticed small details, people who chased opportunity, people whose minds were always scanning the horizon for whatever came next. In a world where every day brought a new challenge, a restless brain wasn't necessarily a flaw. Sometimes, it was exactly the kind of brain you'd want sitting beside you on a long ship headed toward the unknown. Assuming, of course, they remembered to bring the oars. As the days pass, you begin to notice something rather strange about Viking society. Nobody expects you to stay in one place for very long. In fact, if you spent an entire day sitting on a stool staring into the fire, your neighbours wouldn't congratulate you for being productive. They'd probably assume you were sick, injured, or had somehow been cursed by an unusually petty god. Life here simply doesn't allow much sitting. By sunrise, you're already hauling buckets of water from the stream. Then someone asks you to help repair a fishing net. Before you've finished tying the last knot, another family needs an extra pair of hands moving timber for a new shed. Just when you think you finally earned a break, a child comes running through the village shouting that a merchant ship has appeared in the fjord. Within minutes, everyone is moving again. Some head toward the docks, others gather goods to trade. Someone starts arguing over prices before the merchants have even stepped off the boat. Remarkably, this appears to be considered perfectly normal. Modern life often teaches you that success means focusing on one task for hours without interruption. Schools expect it. Offices demand it. Somewhere a manager is still insisting that another spreadsheet will solve everyone's problems. The Vikings had a different philosophy. If the weather suddenly changed, you stopped what you were doing. If a neighbour needed help lifting a boat, your plans changed. If fish were running unusually early, every available person hurried toward the shore. Opportunity rarely sent a written invitation. It usually arrived shouting. This constant movement meant your brain was always receiving new information. The smell of rain drifting in from the sea, fresh tracks crossing a muddy path, smoke rising from a neighbouring farm, birds suddenly taking flight from the forest. Every detail might matter. Ignoring your surroundings wasn't a sign of good concentration. It was an excellent way to become the person everyone spent the evening searching for. Even children grew up learning through movement rather than lectures. Boys and girls climbed rocks, gathered firewood, cared for animals, practiced rowing, learned crafts, and explored the landscape almost as soon as they could walk. Their classroom had no walls, no desks, and thankfully, no surprise group projects. Well, unless someone volunteered everyone to build a boat, which, to be fair, happened surprisingly often. By now you're beginning to understand that Viking society wasn't built around routine. It was built around responding to whatever happened next. And for a mind that naturally craved novelty, variety, and constant stimulation, every sunrise offered something modern. Life often doesn't. A completely different adventure. It doesn't take long before you develop a reputation. Not because you're the strongest person in the village, or the richest, or even the best with an axe, which is probably for the best. Viking healthcare could generously be described as try not to bleed. No, people notice something else. You're always asking questions. What lies beyond that mountain? Has anyone ever followed this river all the way inland? What happens if we leave a few weeks earlier next spring? Why are those birds flying west instead of south? In today's world, asking too many questions can occasionally earn you a polite smile, followed by someone saying, "Let's stay focused." In Viking society, curiosity could make you incredibly valuable. After all, the Vikings became famous not because they stayed comfortably at home. They became famous because someone looked at an enormous freezing ocean and confidently declared, "I bet there's something interesting over there." That level of optimism is either deeply inspiring or slightly concerning, perhaps both. Every voyage began with curiosity. No one knew exactly what waited beyond the horizon. There were rumours, stories, and the occasional trader who insisted he'd seen remarkable places across the sea. Some tales were true, others probably came from someone who'd had just a little too much mead. Still, somebody had to go and find out. As you spend more time around the harbour, you notice that experienced sailors are constantly observing everything around them: the colour of the water, the shape of distant clouds, the direction of the wind, the behaviour of seabirds. Nothing is ignored. The sea rarely announces its intentions politely. It prefers dramatic surprises. Curiosity also drives innovation on land. A blacksmith experiments with a new way of shaping an axe head. A carpenter adjusts the curve of a ship's hull. A farmer tries planting in a different field after noticing where the snow melted first last spring. Nobody calls these people inventors. They're simply trying to make tomorrow a little easier than yesterday. Modern researchers have found that many people with ADHD score highly in novelty seeking. New experiences, new challenges, and unfamiliar ideas naturally capture their attention. Of course, everyone experiences ADHD differently, and curiosity alone doesn't define it. But in a society where exploration was admired rather than discouraged, that desire for something new could become a genuine advantage. You begin to realize that Viking villages aren't built by people who avoid uncertainty. They're built by people willing to step into it. Sometimes that means crossing a dangerous mountain pass. Sometimes it means sailing toward an unknown coastline. And sometimes it means tasting a mushroom that nobody has ever eaten before. History suggests that not every experiment was equally successful. By now you've stopped wondering why nobody ever seems completely relaxed. Not because the Vikings lived in constant fear. Far from it. They laughed, celebrated, told stories, and occasionally competed to see who could invent the most unbelievable tale after several cups of mead. Historical accuracy was, at best, an enthusiastic suggestion. But even during the quiet moments, everyone remained aware of what was happening around them. As you walk through the forest gathering firewood, your attention refuses to settle on just one thing. You notice fresh hoofprints pressed into the damp earth. A raven circles overhead, calling far more loudly than usual. The wind shifts, carrying the smell of smoke from somewhere you hadn't expected. A squirrel darts up a pine tree. Somewhere in the distance, an axe strikes wood with a rhythm that suddenly stops. None of these details seem important by themselves. Together, they paint a picture. The Vikings understood something that modern life often allows us to forget. Your surroundings are constantly talking to you. You simply have to notice. When you're sailing, the same thing happens. Your eyes move from the sail, to the waves, to the shoreline, to the clouds, to the birds gliding overhead. The ocean refuses to stay the same for more than a few minutes. A dark line on the horizon might signal an approaching storm. A flock of seabirds could reveal schools of fish nearby. Floating seaweed might suggest land is closer than you think. Missing one small clue could mean rowing straight into trouble. Modern society often treats being easily distracted as a disadvantage. You're expected to focus on one screen, one conversation, one task, preferably while ignoring the 15 notifications arriving every 5 minutes. The Viking world demanded something almost opposite. Your attention needed to move, constantly. If you became so absorbed repairing a fishing net that you failed to notice black clouds racing across the fjord, everyone would soon be repairing much more than the net. Likewise, villages depended on people noticing small changes before they became large problems. A fence leaning slightly, a goat wandering farther than usual, smoke rising where no smoke should be, ice forming earlier than expected. These weren't random observations, they were information. Of course, constantly scanning your surroundings didn't make anyone invincible. Sometimes the mysterious noise in the bushes really was just a rabbit. Sometimes it was your neighbour looking for his missing goat. And sometimes it was exactly the sort of surprise that convinced everyone to carry an axe in the first place. As you begin seeing the world through Viking eyes, you realise something fascinating. Paying attention to many things at once wasn't considered losing focus. In many situations, it was focus. Because in a world that changed by the hour, The people who noticed the smallest details often became the ones who made it safely home before nightfall. After weeks of running from one task to another, something unexpected happens. You find a job that completely captures your attention. Perhaps it's carving intricate patterns into a wooden chest. Perhaps it's forging an axe head in the village smithy. Or perhaps you've become fascinated by the construction of a longship, watching skilled builders transform ordinary oak into a vessel capable of crossing entire seas. Whatever it is, the rest of the world seems to disappear. The conversations around you fade into the background. The crackling fire becomes little more than distant noise. Hours pass without you noticing. Someone eventually taps you on the shoulder and points toward the sky. It's dark. Apparently, you've missed dinner. Again. Fortunately, in Viking society, this isn't always considered a flaw. Modern psychologists often describe hyperfocus as an intense state of concentration that some people with ADHD experience when something genuinely interests them. It doesn't happen on command, and it certainly isn't available for every task. But when it appears, it can be remarkably powerful, and the Viking world offered countless opportunities for it. Take the village blacksmith. Forging a good sword wasn't simply a matter of heating metal and hitting it until it looked expensive. Every strike mattered. Too much force, and the blade could crack. Too little, and it remained weak. The temperature had to be judged by colour rather than thermometer. The balance had to feel right in the hand. Creating an exceptional weapon demanded complete attention. The same was true for shipbuilding. A Viking longship wasn't assembled from neat instruction manuals with conveniently labelled diagrams. No one opened a scroll titled "Longships for Beginners." Instead, knowledge passed from one generation to the next through observation, practice, and years of patient experience. Every plank had to bend naturally. Every iron rivet had to fit perfectly. Every curve of the hull affected how the ship handled waves, wind, and heavy cargo. A single mistake might not reveal itself until you were halfway across the North Sea, which is admittedly an inconvenient place to discover you've measured something incorrectly. Hyperfocus also appeared in smaller crafts. You might spend an entire afternoon weaving fishing nets, carving decorative knotwork, making jewellery from silver, or repairing leather harnesses. These weren't glamorous jobs, but they required patience, precision, and an eye for tiny details. The Vikings admired people who mastered their craft. A beautifully forged sword, a perfectly balanced ship, or an exquisitely carved drinking horn wasn't merely useful. It reflected skill, reputation, and pride. As you watch the experienced craftsman at work, you begin to understand something important. In today's world, becoming deeply absorbed in one fascinating project can sometimes be interrupted by buzzing phones, incoming messages, and someone asking whether you've got a minute. The Vikings had far fewer interruptions. Mostly ravens, occasionally relatives. Neither was especially helpful. Still, in a society where mastery earned respect, those long stretches of complete concentration could become one of your greatest strengths. Because sometimes the restless mind isn't looking for constant distraction. Sometimes it's simply waiting to find the one thing it never wants to stop doing. By now, you've noticed something that would make most modern travel agents deeply uncomfortable. The Vikings seem remarkably calm about heading toward places they've never seen before. One evening, as everyone gathers around the fire after supper, an experienced sailor spreads a rough map across the table. Calling it a map is perhaps a little generous. It's more of a collection of coastlines, landmarks, and hopeful guesses. He points somewhere beyond the western horizon. "I've heard there's land out there." That's it. No satellite images, no weather forecast, no hotel reservations. Not even a reassuring online review saying, "Beautiful coastline, 4 stars, would definitely invade again, just rumours." And somehow, this is enough for half the village to start discussing supplies. To you, it sounds almost absurd. To them, it sounds like opportunity. Modern psychologists have long recognized that many people with ADHD are naturally drawn toward novelty and risk. That doesn't mean they're reckless, nor does it mean every person with ADHD enjoys taking chances. But new experiences often feel exciting in ways that routine simply doesn't. The Viking world happened to reward exactly that kind of thinking. Almost every success carried uncertainty. Crossing the North Sea was dangerous. Trading with unfamiliar kingdoms carried risks. Exploring unknown rivers meant accepting that you might encounter friendly merchants, or people who preferred introducing themselves with spears. Either way, it certainly kept conversations interesting. Even ordinary life involved constant decisions. Should you leave today or wait another week? Will the winds hold? Is the harvest ready? Should you trade your valuable furs now, or hope prices improve later in the season? There were rarely perfect answers. Waiting too long could mean missing your chance entirely. The Vikings understood something that still feels true today. Sometimes the biggest risk is doing nothing at all. Of course, bravery and impulsiveness weren't exactly the same thing. The wisest Viking leaders didn't rush into every battle swinging an axe and shouting dramatically. Well, not every battle. Successful explorers prepared carefully. They built sturdy ships. They gathered experienced crews. They packed food, water, tools, spare timber, and enough rope to solve problems nobody had imagined yet. Then they accepted that despite all their planning, the unexpected would almost certainly happen anyway. A storm might blow them off course. A river might become impossible to navigate. Supplies might run low. A goat might somehow end up on the ship. Historians aren't entirely sure how often that happened, but given human history, it feels surprisingly plausible. Standing on the shore as another longship disappears beyond the horizon, you begin to understand why Viking society admired people willing to embrace uncertainty. Not because they ignored danger, but because they knew that beyond every unfamiliar horizon lay the possibility of discovering something no one else had ever seen. And sometimes, the people bold enough to ask, "What if?" became the ones who changed history. After several months in the village, you begin to notice something almost impossible to ignore. Nobody tells you to calm down. Nobody suggests you should be more like Olaf, who somehow finds staring at a fishing net for 3 hours to be an exciting afternoon. And nobody asks whether you've considered downloading a meditation app, for one very simple reason. There isn't much time to sit around. From sunrise until well after sunset, there's always something happening. A boat needs unloading. Firewood needs splitting. Animals have wandered somewhere they definitely shouldn't have. Children are climbing onto things they definitely shouldn't have. Someone's roof has started leaking. Someone else's roof has completely disappeared. The village itself feels alive, constantly pulling everyone from one task to another. At first, you wonder if you'll ever catch your breath. Then you realize, neither does anyone else. Life in Viking Scandinavia demanded movement. A farmer wasn't just a farmer. In the spring, you prepared fields. In the summer, you fished, repaired buildings, or joined trading voyages. Autumn became an endless race to gather enough food before winter arrived. And winter brought hunting, woodworking, tool repair, weaving, storytelling, and planning for the next season. Your responsibilities changed almost as quickly as the weather. Modern life often divides work into neat little categories. You have one profession, one office, one job title. If someone suddenly asked the accountant to help build a bridge before lunch and row a ship after dinner, there would probably be several emails to human resources. The Vikings simply called that Tuesday. This constant variety meant there was very little chance to become bored. 1 hour you're carrying barrels of salted fish down to the harbour. The next you're helping sharpen axes before a journey. By afternoon you're repairing a broken cartwheel. Before sunset you've somehow agreed to help your neighbour move an entire cow. You don't remember volunteering. The cow certainly didn't. Even physical movement played an important role. Modern researchers know that many people with ADHD find movement helps regulate attention and maintain focus. While the Vikings had no understanding of neuroscience, They certainly understood that healthy adults were expected to stay active. Walking wasn't exercise, it was transportation. Lifting heavy timber wasn't a workout, it was Tuesday. Rowing for hours across open water wasn't an endurance challenge, it was how you reached the market. By the time evening finally arrives, your body is exhausted, yet your mind feels surprisingly calm. Perhaps it's because your energy hasn't spent the day trapped inside four walls. It has been used. Every climb up a hillside, every swing of the axe, every trip between the longhouse and the shoreline, every unexpected problem that demanded another mile of walking. Looking around the village, you begin to understand why restlessness rarely stood out here. Almost everyone was in motion. The difference wasn't whether you had energy, it was what you did with it. And in a society where every pair of hands mattered, having a little more energy than everyone else wasn't necessarily something to hide. Sometimes, it simply meant you finished first, and someone immediately found you another job to do. By now, you've learned a valuable lesson about Viking life. No matter how carefully you plan your day, the day has other ideas. You wake up expecting to spend the morning repairing fishing nets. Instead, someone bursts into the longhouse announcing that last night's storm has snapped the village pier in half. Within minutes, everyone drops what they're doing. Axes are grabbed, logs are dragged toward the shoreline, ropes appear from seemingly nowhere. Before breakfast has fully settled, you're knee-deep in freezing water trying to hold a beam steady while three other people hammer it back into place. Nobody complains that this wasn't on today's schedule. There wasn't a schedule. That was the schedule. The Vikings lived in a world where unexpected problems weren't occasional interruptions. They were simply part of life. A storm tears a sail halfway through a voyage. You repair it. A wheel breaks 20 miles from home. You fix it. A fishing net tangles around submerged rocks. You untangle it. A goat somehow climbs onto your roof. You stop asking how. You just go get the goat. Modern life often rewards following established procedures. If something breaks, you call customer support. If your computer freezes, you restart it. If neither works, you search the internet and hope someone else has already suffered the exact same problem. The Vikings had no search engines, they had Lars. Lars had seen something similar happen 17 winters ago. Whether Lars actually remembered correctly was another matter entirely. Improvisation became one of the most valuable skills you could possess. A missing tool didn't stop the work. You found another way. A broken oar became firewood. A fallen tree became part of a new fence. Old sailcloth became clothing, blankets or patches for another sail. Almost nothing was wasted. Not because Vikings were naturally minimalist, because replacing things was incredibly difficult. Every object represented hours of labour. Every resource mattered. This constant need to adapt created people who thought creatively rather than rigidly. Instead of asking, "What's the correct solution?" you asked, "What can we do with what we have?" That subtle difference changed everything. Modern researchers have noticed that many people with ADHD often excel when solving immediate, unpredictable problems that require creative thinking. Again, this isn't true for everyone, and ADHD can also make organisation and planning genuinely difficult. But when faced with fast-moving situations where flexibility matters more than routine, some people find themselves performing remarkably well. Standing on the repaired pier as the sun begins to set over the fjord, you realise something. The Vikings didn't survive because everything went according to plan. They survived because they became extraordinarily good at making new plans. Sometimes every hour, sometimes every minute. And in a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed to look like today, that ability wasn't merely useful. It was one of the greatest strengths a person could have. By now, you've accepted something that would sound completely unreasonable back home. Apparently, Leaving your village for several months and sailing thousands of miles away isn't considered running away from your responsibilities. It's considered doing your job. As spring arrives, the harbour transforms into a frenzy of activity. Longships are dragged into the water after spending winter safely on land. Carpenters replace worn planks. Blacksmiths hammer fresh rivets into place. Women sew torn sails while children carry supplies back and forth, trying very hard to look useful and only occasionally dropping something expensive. The entire village seems to move with one purpose. They're getting ready to leave. Not everyone, of course. Someone has to stay behind to tend the farms, care for the animals, and make sure nobody accidentally burns down the longhouse while trying to cook porridge. History suggests that even Vikings appreciated having a home to come back to. But many people, especially younger men, experienced sailors, merchants, and skilled craftsmen, will spend the coming months travelling farther than most people in medieval Europe could even imagine. To England, to Ireland, across the Baltic, into the rivers of Eastern Europe. Some will eventually reach Constantinople, nearly 2,000 miles away, serving as elite guards for the Byzantine Emperor. Others will trade as far east as the lands surrounding the Caspian Sea. For them, movement isn't unusual. Movement is life. Every voyage brings something new. A different language, a different market, different customs, different food. Sometimes you spend the morning bargaining over walrus ivory with a merchant from Frisia. By afternoon, you're learning that another kingdom uses completely different silver coins. By evening, you're trying fermented fish prepared in a way that somehow makes normal fermented fish seem appealing. You politely smile, then quietly look for bread. Modern life often encourages specialization. You become one thing: an accountant, a mechanic, a teacher, a programmer. The Vikings wore far more hats. A merchant might also be a farmer. A sailor might become a warrior. A craftsman might spend one summer exploring rivers no one in his family had ever seen before. Your role changed as quickly as opportunity appeared. For someone whose mind naturally craves novelty, this world offers an endless supply of fresh experiences. No two ports are alike. No two trading negotiations unfold the same way. No two voyages follow identical winds. You never quite know what waits beyond the next coastline. Sometimes it's a thriving marketplace filled with exotic goods. Sometimes it's terrible weather. Sometimes it's both. Standing aboard the longship as your village slowly disappears behind you, you realize something remarkable. For the Vikings, curiosity wasn't just a personality trait. It became an economy. An entire civilization built itself around people willing to chase the unknown. And if your mind was always searching for the next challenge, you had just found the perfect century to be alive. Before arriving in the Viking world, you probably imagined that every disagreement ended the same way. Someone reached for an axe. Everyone else ducked. Roll the credits. The truth, however, is considerably more interesting. The longer you live here, the more you realize that Vikings spent far more time talking than fighting, which is fortunate. Axes are exhausting. One summer morning, you accompany several experienced traders to a nearby settlement. They're hoping to exchange furs, iron tools, and amber for grain and silver. As the merchants gather near the docks, you expect the negotiations to be quick. Instead, they last for hours. Every offer is questioned. Every price is debated. Every agreement becomes a performance. One merchant praises the quality of his walrus ivory as though it were carved by Odin himself. The buyer squints at it for several minutes before replying that he's seen straighter tusks on a very old pig. Nobody seems offended. Apparently, This is simply how bargaining works. The Vikings understood that words could earn as much wealth as swords. The same happened during village meetings. When disputes arose over land, livestock, inheritance, or broken promises, people gathered at assemblies known as things. Here, respected men argued their cases before their neighbours, who listened carefully before reaching a decision. It wasn't a courtroom in the modern sense, but it wasn't chaos either. The person who spoke clearly, remembered details, and adapted their arguments to the crowd often held a significant advantage. You begin to notice how quickly conversations shift. One moment, people discuss fishing. The next, they're debating weather patterns. Then someone remembers a story from 20 years ago that somehow becomes relevant. Then another person interrupts with news from Norway. Nobody seems bothered by these rapid changes. Everyone simply follows along. Modern conversations often reward staying perfectly on topic. Viking conversations wandered like rivers. Surprisingly, they still reached their destination. For someone whose thoughts naturally leap from one idea to another, this style of discussion feels comfortable. Connections appear where other people might not notice them. One story reminds you of another. A trader's complaint sparks an entirely new solution. A casual observation becomes tomorrow's plan. Modern researchers have found that many people with ADHD excel at making unexpected connections between ideas, particularly during creative discussions. Of course, those same conversations can also become overwhelming or difficult to organise. Like every trait we've explored tonight, it depends on the individual and the situation. Still, standing among the merchants as another deal is finally sealed with a handshake, you begin to understand something. The Vikings didn't succeed simply because they were fearless sailors. They succeeded because they could persuade, negotiate, improvise, and think on their feet. Sometimes the sharpest tool in the village wasn't hanging from someone's belt. It was the story they knew exactly how to tell. And unlike an axe, a good story rarely needed sharpening. After months of travelling, trading, and working alongside the people of your village, you've probably started feeling rather confident. You know how to row. You can repair a fishing net without tying yourself into it. You can even tell the difference between weather that looks unpleasant and weather that is actively trying to kill you. Congratulations. You're becoming a Viking. Then everything goes wrong. It begins with what seems like an ordinary trading voyage. The sea is calm, the wind is steady, and the crew is in unusually good spirits. Someone even jokes that perhaps the gods have finally decided to give everyone an easy journey. The gods, apparently, enjoy irony. By afternoon, dark clouds begin piling up over the horizon. The wind shifts without warning. Waves grow larger with every passing minute, and suddenly the peaceful fjord has transformed into a rolling wall of grey water. The sail snaps violently. A rope breaks. One of the supply barrels disappears overboard before anyone can grab it. Within moments, every single plan has become completely useless. Nobody panics. Nobody stands around arguing about whose fault it is. Nobody insists on holding a committee meeting before taking action. Everyone simply moves. One sailor lowers the damaged sail. Another grabs spare rope. Someone begins bailing water. You throw your weight against an oar to keep the ship facing the waves. The storm doesn't care whose job description this was. In the Viking world, survival belongs to the people who adapt first. Eventually the wind weakens. The sea calms. The longship survives, although it now looks considerably less impressive than it did that morning. Back in the village, nobody laughs about the damaged sail, because every person standing there has a similar story. A failed harvest, a broken ship, a trading expedition that earned almost nothing, a hunting trip that returned with nothing but cold feet and increasingly creative excuses. Failure wasn't unusual, it was expected. The important question wasn't whether something would go wrong, it was what you learned afterward. Modern life often treats mistakes as something to avoid at all costs. A failed project, a poor grade, or a missed opportunity can feel like the end of the story. The Vikings saw things differently. A failed voyage taught you how to prepare better. A broken tool showed you how to build a stronger one. A bad decision became experience, assuming you survived long enough to complain about it. And as you sit beside the fire that evening, helping repair the torn sail instead of throwing it away, you realize something surprisingly comforting. The Vikings didn't become extraordinary because everything worked perfectly. They became extraordinary because they expected problems, adapted quickly, and tried again. Sometimes the most valuable skill wasn't avoiding failure. It was refusing to let failure be the final chapter of the story. The longer you live among the Vikings, the more one surprising truth begins to stand out. Not everyone is expected to be the same. In fact, trying to make everyone identical would probably seem ridiculous. One man can spend an entire afternoon shaping a single piece of wood until it's perfectly smooth. Another can't sit still for 5 minutes, but somehow knows every hidden path through the surrounding forests. One woman remembers generations of family history without forgetting a single name. Another can negotiate a better trade deal before you've even finished saying hello. Nobody is good at everything, but everyone is expected to become exceptionally good at something. As the village prepares for another trading season, you begin noticing how naturally people drift toward the work that suits them best. The patient craftsman stays in the workshop, carefully fitting planks together for a new longship. The experienced navigator studies the coastline, already thinking several voyages ahead. The energetic young men unload cargo before anyone has time to ask for volunteers. The storytellers gather children around the evening fire, filling the longhouse with tales of Odin, Thor, giants, dragons, and ancestors, whose heroic accomplishments become slightly more impressive every winter. History has always been vulnerable to exaggeration, especially after the third cup of mead. You realize that Viking villages survive because different personalities complement one another. The cautious farmer prevents unnecessary mistakes. The adventurous sailor discovers new opportunities. The clever trader builds relationships with distant kingdoms. The blacksmith quietly makes sure everyone else's plans don't fall apart halfway through the journey. No single type of person could have built the Viking world alone. It required people who thought differently. Modern society sometimes encourages everyone to work in remarkably similar ways. Sit still, follow instructions, complete tasks in the correct order. Try not to ask too many questions before lunch. The Viking world couldn't afford that luxury. Every expedition needed different strengths. Every settlement depended upon people approaching problems from different angles. Looking around the village, you begin wondering whether anyone here would even recognize that one person's mind worked differently from another's. Perhaps they would. Perhaps they simply described it differently. Instead of saying someone couldn't sit still, they might say he was born for the sea. Instead of calling someone easily distracted, they might notice that she always spotted danger before anyone else. Instead of wondering why someone constantly chased new experiences, they might simply hand them an oar and point toward the horizon. Because after spending nearly a year among these remarkable people, you've started to understand something surprisingly timeless. A society becomes stronger not when everyone thinks alike, but when it finds a place where different kinds of minds can all contribute. And the Vikings, whether they realized it or not, became remarkably good at doing exactly that. After spending more than a year in the village, you've stopped trying to figure out what a typical Viking looks like, mostly because no such person seems to exist. The man who can navigate through thick sea fog without losing his bearings somehow forgets where he left his boots every single morning. The strongest warrior in the village becomes completely confused whenever someone asks him to mend a fishing net. The blacksmith who can forge an almost perfect sword struggles to remember the names of half the traders who visit every summer. Meanwhile, the old woman who has never sailed farther than the neighbouring fjord can recite family histories stretching back generations without missing a single ancestor. Everyone has strengths. Everyone has weaknesses. Nobody appears particularly surprised by this. Modern society often creates an invisible picture of what a successful person should look like. Organised, predictable, always on time, always calm, always able to finish one task before beginning another. The Viking world wasn't nearly so tidy. Life simply refused to cooperate. One week brought calm seas. The next brought storms. One harvest was abundant. The next barely filled the storehouses. Some expeditions returned with silver, silk, spices, and stories of distant kingdoms. Others returned with little more than tired sailors and another reminder that the North Atlantic enjoys embarrassing, confident people. Success depended less on fitting into a single mould and more on responding to whatever happened next. As you watch people work throughout the village, you begin noticing something fascinating. Nobody spends much time comparing themselves to one another. The shipbuilder isn't trying to become the village poet. The shepherd doesn't suddenly decide to forge swords. The storyteller isn't expected to lead every voyage. People naturally gravitate toward the work that suits them best. Not because someone administered a personality test, because years of experience revealed where each person contributed the most. Modern researchers often describe ADHD as existing on a spectrum, with different people experiencing very different combinations of strengths and challenges. Some struggle mainly with attention, others with impulsivity, organisation, emotional regulation, or restlessness. There is no single ADHD personality, just as there was no single Viking personality. That may be the most important lesson of all. When we ask whether ADHD would have been useful in Viking society, the answer isn't simply yes or no. It depends. On the individual, on the circumstances, on the season, on the role they happen to fill. Standing outside the longhouse as another sunset paints the fjord in shades of gold and deep blue, you realise that the Vikings never built their world by expecting everyone to think exactly alike. They built it by allowing different people to solve different problems. And perhaps that's a lesson worth carrying back across 1,000 years. After all, even the best longship wasn't built from identical pieces of wood. Eventually, every voyage comes to an end. The longship glides back into the familiar fjord, its hull carrying weathered sailors, worn tools, and stories that will somehow become even more impressive before winter is over. As the shoreline grows closer, you recognise the same mountains that watched you leave months ago. The same longhouse, the same harbour, the same people waiting on the beach. Yet something has changed. Not the village. You. When you first arrived, you couldn't understand why life here felt so different. Everything seemed unpredictable. Nothing followed a neat schedule. Every day demanded another decision, another adjustment, another unexpected challenge. You kept waiting for life to settle down. It never did. And somehow, that stopped bothering you. You realise you've spent the past year moving almost constantly, walking through forests, rowing across icy water, repairing tools, trading with strangers, building things, fixing things, learning things. No 2 weeks have looked exactly alike. Looking back, you struggle to remember a single day that was truly ordinary. There was always another problem to solve, another journey to prepare for, another skill to learn, another opportunity waiting just beyond the horizon. Modern life often asks people to adapt themselves to the system. The Viking world frequently asked the system to adapt to reality instead. If storms came early, plans changed. If fish arrived sooner than expected, everyone went fishing. If new trade routes opened, people followed them. There was remarkably little attachment to doing something simply because that's how we've always done it. Practical solutions mattered more than perfect routines. As you watch the village unloading another ship, you begin noticing something you've overlooked all along. Nobody seems particularly interested in whether someone works exactly like everyone else. What matters is whether they contribute. Can you build? Can you sail? Can you negotiate? Can you hunt? Can you tell stories that keep children awake far longer than their parents had hoped? Congratulations. You're useful. The details of how your mind arrives there seem surprisingly unimportant. Of course, Viking society wasn't some perfect world where every difference was celebrated. Life remained brutally difficult. People struggled. Mistakes carried serious consequences. Some personalities undoubtedly fit certain roles better than others. We're not suggesting that ADHD magically became an advantage every moment of every day. Far from it. Rather, you've discovered something much simpler. Certain environments naturally reward certain ways of thinking. And Viking society happened to reward adaptability, curiosity, quick thinking, creativity, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty far more often than many modern environments do. As the evening fire begins warming the longhouse once again, you find yourself smiling. Not because you've become a Viking, that would probably require significantly more beard, but because you've learned that there has never been one single correct kind of mind. History is filled with people who succeeded not by changing who they were, but by finding a world that needed exactly what they already had. Now, as your journey through the Viking Age slowly comes to an end, you find yourself sitting outside the longhouse one last time. The sun is setting behind the mountains, turning the fjord into a sheet of gold. Somewhere down by the shore, a blacksmith is finishing the day's work with a few final strikes of his hammer. Children are chasing each other between the houses, somehow still full of energy despite having spent the entire day climbing trees, carrying firewood, and inventing games that almost certainly violate several modern safety regulations. The sheep are making noise again. They're very committed to the role. As you watch the village settle into another quiet evening, it's hard not to think back to the question that brought you here. Would someone with ADHD have found life easier in Viking society? The honest answer is, sometimes, not always, and certainly not in every situation. ADHD is a real neurodevelopmental condition that affects people in different ways. Some struggle mainly with inattention, others with impulsivity, emotional regulation, organization, or hyperactivity. Many experience several of these challenges at once. Viking life wouldn't have magically erased those difficulties. Forgetting important equipment before a voyage was still a problem. Acting too quickly during a tense negotiation could still create enemies. Losing track of time while carving a piece of wood might still earn you a gentle reminder that everyone else finished dinner an hour ago. Some things, it seems, never change, but history also reminds us that every society rewards different qualities. The Viking world valued adaptability, curiosity, courage, creative problem solving, the ability to notice small changes before they became large ones, the willingness to explore unfamiliar places instead of fearing them. Many of those qualities overlap with strengths that some people with ADHD describe today. Perhaps that's why this question is so fascinating. It isn't really about Vikings. It's about context. Modern society often asks people to fit themselves into systems designed around routine, schedules, paperwork, and long periods of sustained attention. The Viking world demanded something far less predictable. It asked people to respond to storms, to changing seasons, to unfamiliar coastlines, to unexpected opportunities, to problems that nobody had solved before. Neither world is inherently better. They're simply different. In the spring of 1884, Paris was already convinced it was the most beautiful city on earth. The wide boulevards glistened after fresh rain. Horse-drawn carriages rattled past elegant cafes where artists argued over coffee that had long since gone cold. The Seine reflected rows of grand stone buildings that had transformed the city under Baron Haussmann's ambitious redesign. To many Parisians, their capital needed no improvement. It certainly did not need a gigantic iron structure sticking into the sky. Yet beneath the confidence, there was pressure. France had a deadline. The year 1889 would mark 100 years since the French Revolution, and the government intended to celebrate with an exposition universelle, a World's Fair larger and more spectacular than anything seen before. It would attract millions of visitors and remind everyone that France remained a leader in art, science and engineering, despite recent political turmoil and military humiliation after the Franco-Prussian War. There was only one problem. Every World's Fair needed a centrepiece. London had amazed visitors decades earlier with the Crystal Palace, a breathtaking building made almost entirely of glass. America was rapidly becoming an industrial giant. Germany was flexing its engineering muscles. Paris needed something unforgettable, something that would leave every visitor staring upward in disbelief. Committees gathered, architects sharpened pencils, engineers sketched impossible dreams. Hundreds of proposals flooded in. Some envisioned colossal fountains reaching higher than church spires. Others imagined enormous statues of liberty carrying blazing torches. One particularly ambitious proposal suggested constructing a gigantic stone lighthouse in the middle of Paris. Another involved an immense mechanical monument that would shower visitors with lights every evening. There were enough grand ideas to fill several notebooks, and just enough practical sense among them to fill perhaps half a page. Then came an idea unlike anything before it. A tower, not of marble, not of stone, iron. 300 meters of exposed iron rising above every cathedral, palace and monument in Europe. To modernize it sounds inevitable. Of course, Paris would embrace what became its greatest symbol. But in 1884, the proposal sounded closer to madness than genius. Many engineers quietly admired its boldness. Politicians saw an opportunity to impress the world. Ordinary citizens, however, struggled to imagine why anyone would willingly build what appeared to be an enormous industrial chimney in the heart of the world's artistic capital. After all, iron belonged in bridges, railway stations and factories. It did not belong towering over Paris. And as the design slowly emerged from drawing boards into public view, the battle over the future skyline of France was only beginning. If the idea of an iron tower sounded outrageous, the man most people blamed for it wasn't even its original inventor. That distinction belonged to two talented engineers working for the engineering company owned by Gustave Eiffel. Maurice Koechlin and Émile Nouguier had been quietly sketching ideas during the summer of 1884 when they arrived at a startling concept. 4 enormous iron legs, spreading outward like the roots of a giant tree before curving gracefully together into a single tower reaching nearly 300 meters into the sky. When they first placed the drawings on the table, the reaction was underwhelming. Even Gustave Eiffel himself wasn't immediately convinced. The design looked more like the skeleton of some mechanical creature than a monument worthy of Paris. Elegant was not the first word that came to mind. Practical, perhaps. Ambitious, certainly. Beautiful. That remained very much up for debate. Still, Eiffel recognised something his competitors did not. The tower wasn't merely supposed to decorate the skyline. It was supposed to prove a point. France wanted to demonstrate that modern engineering could be every bit as inspiring as ancient architecture. Stone cathedrals had dominated skylines for centuries, but iron represented the future. Railways stretched across Europe. Massive bridges crossed valleys once considered impossible to span. Factories produced machines at a pace unimaginable only decades earlier. Why should a monument still be carved from stone? Eiffel asked architect Stephen Sauvestre to refine the proposal, softening its harsh industrial appearance. Decorative arches connected the four legs. Elegant pavilions were added to the lower platforms. Ornamental details broke up the rigid framework. The result was still undeniably an iron tower, but now it carried at least a hint of Parisian sophistication. In 1886, the French government announced a competition for the centrepiece of the World's Fair. More than 100 proposals arrived. Some were imaginative, others bordered on absurd. One suggested constructing a gigantic guillotine to commemorate the revolution. Another proposed an immense granite column. There were elaborate fountains, monumental arches, and countless statues, each claiming to symbolize the greatness of France. Standing among them was Eiffel's towering lattice of iron. At first glance, it hardly seemed the obvious winner. It would be the tallest structure ever built by human hands. It required thousands of precisely manufactured iron pieces fitting together with astonishing accuracy. Wind pressures had to be calculated, unlike anything attempted before. Critics insisted it would collapse under its own weight or topple during the first serious storm. Yet the calculations kept proving otherwise. Piece by piece, number by number, Eiffel's engineers demonstrated that the seemingly impossible tower was not an act of reckless imagination. It was mathematics made visible. The government awarded Eiffel the contract. On paper, France had chosen its monument, but convincing Paris itself would prove far more difficult than winning a competition. Winning the competition should have settled everything. Instead, it started a civil war of opinions. As news of the tower spread across Paris, excitement quickly gave way to outrage. The proposal escaped government offices and engineering journals and landed exactly where Gustave Eiffel had hoped it wouldn't, on the breakfast tables of the city's artists, writers, musicians and architects. Their verdict was swift. This tower had to be stopped. To understand their anger, you have to remember what Paris represented in the late 19th century. It wasn't simply France's capital. It was widely considered the artistic capital of the world. Visitors came to admire the Gothic beauty of Notre Dame, the graceful dome of Les Invalides, the Louvre's endless galleries, and elegant stone buildings stretching for miles. Everything followed a certain harmony. The city wasn't perfect, but it possessed a visual language developed over centuries. Now imagine dropping a 300-metre iron lattice into the middle of it. To many Parisians, it felt less like progress and more like vandalism. Then came the famous protest. In February of 1887, a group of some of France's most respected cultural figures published an open letter in the newspaper Le Temps. It wasn't written by jealous rivals or political opponents. The signatures included celebrated novelist Guy de Maupassant, composer Charles Gounod, architect Charles Garnier, painter William Bouguereau, and dozens of other prominent names. Their language was anything but diplomatic. They described the proposed tower as a gigantic black factory chimney, that would dominate Paris like an enormous stain. They argued that every monument in the city, from Notre Dame to the Arc de Triomphe, would disappear beneath its overwhelming presence. They even predicted that visitors would no longer remember Paris for its elegance. Instead, they would remember only the iron monster towering above everything else. For many readers, the argument made perfect sense. Paris was famous because it was timeless. Factories belonged on the outskirts of the city, where smoke already filled the sky. Railways belonged near stations. Iron belonged inside bridges and industrial workshops. Why turn the world's most admired city into a monument to machinery? Newspapers eagerly fueled the controversy. Political cartoons portrayed the tower crushing nearby buildings. Satirical magazines imagined Parisians hanging laundry from its beams or using it as an oversized flagpole. Café conversations became heated debates, with friends arguing over whether the project represented genius or madness. Rarely had a construction project inspired so much emotion before a single foundation stone had even been laid. The controversy became so intense that many assumed the government would eventually surrender to public pressure. After all, surely no politician wanted to become remembered as the person who ruined the skyline of Paris forever. But Gustave Eiffel had no intention of walking away. Instead of retreating, he decided to fight his critics with the one weapon he trusted more than public opinion: reason. Reason was persuasive. Concrete was even more persuasive. In January of 1887, while newspapers were still publishing furious letters and Parisian cafes buzzed with arguments, workers quietly arrived at the Champ de Mars. The debate had not ended. If anything, it had grown louder. But Gustave Eiffel understood something many of his critics did not. Once construction began, stopping it would become much harder. The first task looked almost disappointingly ordinary. There was no dramatic raising of iron beams or spectacular tower suddenly appearing on the skyline. Instead, crews spent months digging enormous foundations for the tower's 4 legs. 2 of them sat close to the River Seine, forcing engineers to use compressed air caissons so men could excavate below the water table without flooding the site. It was slow, exhausting work. Visitors hoping to witness the birth of history mostly saw muddy trenches and men covered in dirt. Critics seized the opportunity. "Look," they laughed, "this ridiculous project cannot even get out of the ground." But beneath the surface, something remarkable was taking shape. Every single piece of iron had already been designed long before arriving at the construction site. Eiffel's factory produced more than 18,000 individual components, each drawn with extraordinary precision. Every beam, every plate, every connection had its exact place in the giant puzzle. There was almost no improvisation. If one piece was even slightly wrong, thousands of others could no longer fit together. Each component arrived at the Champ de Mars labelled with identification numbers, ready to be assembled like an enormous mechanical kit. Modern engineers would recognise the process immediately. In many ways, the Eiffel Tower resembled a giant prefabricated structure decades before such methods became common. Then the iron finally began to rise. Slowly, almost cautiously, the 4 legs climbed upward. Huge wooden scaffolds surrounded them. Steam-powered cranes crept along tracks built directly into the unfinished legs, lifting heavier and heavier sections into position. Workers balanced high above the ground, fastening temporary bolts before teams of riveters permanently secured each connection. The sound became impossible to ignore. Day after day, the sharp metallic rhythm of hammers striking glowing rivets echoed across western Paris. Thousands upon thousands of rivets locked the tower together, each installed by small teams working with astonishing coordination. One worker heated the rivet until it glowed red. Another tossed it through the air with tongs. A third caught it, inserted it into the joint, while a fourth hammered the opposite end into its final mushroom shape before the metal cooled. It was dangerous work, yet remarkably few lives were lost during construction, thanks largely to Eiffel's unusually strict safety measures. Guardrails, movable platforms, and safety screens were installed wherever possible, precautions that were considered excessive by many builders of the time. As the months passed, something unexpected happened. The higher the tower climbed, the harder it became for Parisians to pretend it would never exist. The temporary monstrosity was no longer just an architect's drawing. It was becoming the tallest structure the world had ever seen. By the spring of 1889, the impossible had become unavoidable. The tower stood complete. For more than 2 years, Parisians had watched it rise section by section, growing taller than rooftops, church spires, and finally every monument that had ever defined their city. What had begun as an engineering drawing was now a 300-metre giant dominating the skyline from nearly every neighbourhood. Whether people loved it or hated it, one thing was certain: no one could ignore it anymore. As the Exposition Universelle prepared to open its gates, visitors poured into Paris from every corner of the globe. Trains arrived packed with tourists, eager to witness the celebration of France's technological achievements. Many had read about the controversial tower in newspapers long before they arrived. Now they wanted to see the monster with their own eyes. And then something remarkable happened. Instead of recoiling in horror, most visitors were fascinated. Crowds gathered at the base simply to stare upward. From directly beneath the 4 enormous legs, the intricate latticework seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, becoming finer and more delicate the higher it climbed. What critics had dismissed as an ugly pile of iron suddenly revealed an unexpected elegance. It wasn't solid. It almost looked light. The open framework allowed sunlight to pass through it. From different angles, the tower seemed to change shape entirely. Every step revealed a new pattern of intersecting beams, each serving a precise structural purpose, while creating an appearance that felt strangely artistic. People queued for hours to climb it. The elevators themselves became attractions, carrying passengers upward through the curved legs before ascending toward platforms no human had ever stood upon before. Those willing to tackle the stairs discovered a reward no postcard could capture: Paris from above. For centuries, the city's beauty had been admired from its streets. Now, for the first time, ordinary visitors could see the entire capital spread beneath them like a living map. The Seine twisted through the city like a ribbon. Notre Dame, once one of the tallest landmarks in Paris, looked surprisingly modest. The Arc de Triomphe, the Louvre, and endless rows of elegant boulevards formed a breathtaking panorama unlike anything people had experienced before. Many descended speechless. Even some early skeptics reluctantly admitted that the view alone justified the climb. Not everyone surrendered, of course. Guy de Maupassant supposedly continued eating lunch in the tower's restaurant, because, as the story goes, it was the one place in Paris where he did not have to look at the tower itself. Whether entirely true or slightly embellished over time, the anecdote perfectly captured the stubbornness of some opponents. Yet public opinion was shifting. The structure that had nearly torn the city apart was quickly becoming the attraction everyone wanted to see first. Paris had not lost its identity. Instead, it had gained a new one. There was one final twist that almost no one remembers today. The Eiffel Tower was never supposed to stay. When Gustave Eiffel signed his agreement with the French government, the contract granted him the right to operate the tower for only 20 years after the World's Fair. Once that period expired, ownership would return to the city of Paris. And then, the tower was expected to be dismantled. Many officials assumed its purpose would end with the exhibition. It had served as a spectacular attraction, demonstrated French engineering, and attracted millions of visitors. Surely, after 2 decades, Paris would be ready to reclaim its skyline. Iron was valuable. The tower could simply be taken apart and sold as scrap. Even after its success at the World's Fair, critics continued insisting that its days were numbered. Gustave Eiffel knew that admiration alone would not save it. The tower needed to become useful. So he transformed it into something far greater than a tourist attraction. Scientists began using the upper platforms for meteorological observations, measuring winds, temperatures, and atmospheric pressure at heights never before available in Paris. Physicists conducted experiments that could not be performed anywhere else in France. Then came one of the tower's greatest advantages: radio. As wireless communication emerged at the turn of the 20th century, engineers realized the enormous iron structure made an almost perfect antenna. Military operators began transmitting signals across remarkable distances, proving the tower could play a vital role in national defense. Suddenly, destroying it no longer seemed like such a clever idea. When the original concession approached its end in the early 20th century, the conversation had changed completely. People were no longer asking, "Why does Paris need this tower?" They were asking, "Why would we remove it?" The answer became increasingly difficult to justify. The tower had become scientifically valuable. It had become economically valuable. And perhaps most surprisingly, it had become emotionally valuable. The very monument that artists once described as an industrial nightmare had slowly woven itself into the identity of Paris. Painters who had mocked it now included it in their landscapes. Photographers sought the perfect angle to capture its silhouette. Visitors could no longer imagine the city without it standing above the rooftops. Its greatest victory was not engineering, it was familiarity. Generation after generation grew up with the tower watching over the city until people found it impossible to picture Paris without it. Today, it is difficult to believe there was ever a time when the Eiffel Tower was considered a mistake. It appears on postcards, films, paintings, souvenirs, and countless photographs taken every single day. It has become one of the most recognizable landmarks on Earth. Yet history often works this way. The ideas that seem most obvious in hindsight are often the ones that face the fiercest resistance at the beginning. If Paris had listened to its loudest critics, the world's most famous skyline might look very different today. And the monument that almost never existed would never have become the symbol of an entire nation. When most people picture a Viking, they imagine someone who hasn't seen soap since childhood. A towering warrior with tangled hair, an enormous beard filled with yesterday's dinner, and just enough mud to qualify as a small hill. Hollywood has spent decades convincing us that the more dirt a Viking wore, the more dangerous he looked. It makes for entertaining films. It also happens to be almost completely wrong. If you had stepped into a Scandinavian town around the year 1000, you might have been surprised by what you saw. Yes, there were blacksmiths covered in soot and fishermen smelling like the sea. But among them walked men carefully combing their hair, trimming their beards, and making sure they looked respectable before heading into public. To the Vikings, appearance wasn't a luxury. It was part of your reputation. Archaeologists have uncovered this story one small object at a time. Across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, and Viking settlements stretching as far as England, excavations have revealed an astonishing number of grooming tools. Beautifully carved combs made from antler and bone appear so frequently that they're among the most common personal items found at Viking sites. And the combs weren't crude tools either. Many were finely decorated with intricate patterns that required hours of skilled craftsmanship. Some came inside protective cases so the teeth wouldn't break while travelling. Others were carefully repaired instead of discarded, suggesting they were valuable possessions worth maintaining for years. The surprises don't stop there. Excavations have also uncovered tweezers, razors, small knives for trimming hair, and curious little tools known as ear spoons, used to clean the ears. Apparently, even a fearsome Norse raider understood that invading England with spotless ears was simply good manners. These weren't rare objects owned only by kings. They appear in graves belonging to ordinary men and women alike, suggesting personal grooming was woven into everyday life throughout Viking society. Written accounts tell a similar story. One English chronicler complained that Danish settlers had an unfair advantage with local women because they combed their hair regularly, changed their clothes often, and bathed more frequently than the English expected. His criticism was meant as an insult. Instead, it accidentally became one of history's greatest compliments. Imagine being so attractive that a monk writes an official complaint about your hairstyle. Not a bad review, really. Of course, Vikings didn't groom themselves simply to impress potential husbands or wives. Their hair carried meanings far deeper than fashion. A well-kept beard could command respect. A carefully chosen hairstyle could reveal your age, your wealth, your status, or even your ambitions. Long before anyone heard the phrase "dress for success," the Vikings already understood that the first battle you fought each day was the one against a bad first impression. And it all began with a comb. If every Viking owned a comb, then grooming clearly mattered. But it wasn't simply about staying clean. It was about telling the world exactly who you were before saying a single word. Long before uniforms, business suits, or social media profiles, your appearance announced your place in society. A stranger could often make a fairly good guess about your age, your wealth, your success, and perhaps even your occupation simply by looking at your hair and beard. For Viking men, hair was closely tied to honour. A thick, healthy head of hair suggested strength and good fortune. A full beard projected maturity and authority. While not every Norseman could grow an impressive beard, genetics has been humbling men for thousands of years, those who could often treated it with obvious care. A neglected beard suggested something else entirely. It hinted that its owner lacked discipline. The sagas, written centuries later but preserving older traditions, frequently describe notable men by their appearance. Nicknames often referred to hair colour, beards, or distinctive hairstyles. There was Harald Fairhair, perhaps the most famous example. According to tradition, Harald vowed not to cut or comb his hair until he had united Norway under his rule. Imagine making a promise that required months, perhaps years, of intentionally having terrible hair. Fortunately for Harald, once he succeeded, the first thing he reportedly did was have it washed, trimmed, and beautifully styled. The new look became so famous that history remembered him not for messy hair, but for magnificent hair. That says quite a lot about Viking priorities. Hair also played an important role in law and punishment. Across many medieval societies, forcibly cutting someone's hair was considered a deep humiliation. While the details varied from region to region, hair could symbolize dignity, freedom, and personal honor. Losing it against your will was not simply inconvenient. It was public shame. Women, too, devoted considerable attention to their hair. Archaeological finds include decorative pins, ribbons, beads, and finely crafted combs buried alongside women of different social classes. Long, well-kept hair was often admired, though practical braids were common for daily work. Loose hair might appear during special occasions, while married women in some contexts likely covered their hair with linen head coverings or scarves. The exact styles changed from family to family and from one Scandinavian region to another. There was no official Viking haircut. Instead, there were countless variations shaped by local customs, personal preference, and practicality. One man might wear his hair shoulder length with a carefully trimmed beard. Another preferred shaved sides with longer hair on top. Some braided sections of their hair before long voyages. Others kept everything shorter for convenience during farming or travel. The point was never to copy everyone else. It was to appear intentional. To the Vikings, looking well-groomed sent a simple message: I take care of myself. And if someone couldn't be trusted to care for their own hair, perhaps they couldn't be trusted with much else either. Looking respectable around the village was one thing. Preparing for a voyage or a battle was something else entirely. Before a Viking stepped aboard a longship, he didn't simply grab an axe and hope for the best. There were weapons to inspect, provisions to load, sails to repair, and surprisingly, hair to arrange. That wasn't vanity. It was ritual. A warrior who neglected his appearance risked looking careless before he'd even lifted his shield. In a society where reputation could be as valuable as silver, first impressions mattered. Your fellow warriors noticed whether you carried yourself with confidence. So did your enemies. The morning likely began with washing. Contrary to popular belief, Vikings were remarkably fond of bathing. Saturday was traditionally associated with washing, so much so that the Old Norse word laugardagar, meaning washing day, eventually became the modern Scandinavian word for Saturday. While daily baths were hardly practical during long expeditions, cleanliness before setting off was considered entirely sensible. Then came the hair. Long hair was useful in cold Scandinavian winters, but it also became a nuisance during combat. Loose strands falling into your eyes while someone swung an axe at your head was an inconvenience you experienced only once. Braids solved that problem. Many Viking men likely tied back longer hair before travelling or fighting. Braids kept hair under control, prevented tangles during weeks at sea, and fit comfortably beneath helmets. Although modern television often invents wildly elaborate hairstyles with dozens of tiny braids and shaved geometric patterns, archaeological evidence suggests real Viking hairstyles were generally more practical than theatrical. Simple worked. Simple also survived storms. Beards required attention too. A tangled beard could snag on clothing, armor straps, or even another man's grip during a struggle. Keeping it trimmed and combed wasn't merely about appearance, it reduced problems in everyday life. Besides, spending 3 weeks aboard a crowded ship without grooming your beard was an excellent way to become unpopular with everyone sharing the voyage. The comb returned once again. Small enough to carry on a belt or tucked safely inside a protective case, it was one of the few personal items many Vikings considered worth taking almost everywhere. Archaeologists have found broken combs at trading towns, farms, military camps, and overseas settlements, suggesting they travelled wherever their owners did. Imagine preparing to cross the North Sea. You pack dried fish, a spare tunic, your knife, your whetstone, your comb. One of these things seems less dramatic than the others, yet it appears just as consistently in the archaeological record. That says something. To outsiders, the Vikings were terrifying because of their ships, weapons, and fearlessness. To the Vikings themselves, confidence began long before battle. It started the moment they looked into polished metal or still water, straightened their hair, ran a comb through their beard, and stepped onto the ship looking like someone ready to make history. A Viking's hairstyle had another job besides staying neat. It had to make an impression. Long before armies wore matching uniforms, appearance helped shape how people judged you. When two groups met on a lonely road or across a windswept beach, there were only a few seconds to size each other up. Clothing mattered. Weapons mattered. So did hair. Picture a group of Viking warriors stepping off a longship. They weren't the wild, unrecognisable figures often shown in modern movies. Their hair was combed. Their beards were shaped. Many had tied their hair back with leather cords or woven it into simple braids that stayed secure during travel. Some wore their hair loose over their shoulders, while others preferred it shorter around the neck for convenience. The goal wasn't to look fashionable. The goal was to look confident. Confidence itself could be a weapon. Human beings have always judged strangers by their appearance. A person who looked disciplined suggested they were disciplined. Someone who carried themselves proudly seemed more capable before they had spoken a single word. Vikings understood this instinctively, even if they never wrote a handbook explaining it. Looking formidable could prevent a fight before it started. At the same time, looking respectable helped in situations where fighting was the last thing anyone wanted. Not every Viking was a raider. Many spent far more time trading than battling. They sailed to bustling ports across Europe, buying silver, silk, spices, furs, walrus ivory, and countless everyday goods. When arriving at a foreign marketplace, appearing clean and trustworthy could be just as valuable as carrying a full purse. No merchant wanted to negotiate with someone who looked like they had wrestled a sheep on the voyage over. A well-groomed appearance suggested reliability. That mattered in business. It mattered in diplomacy. And it certainly mattered in romance. Several medieval writers, especially those living in England, complained that Scandinavian men attracted local women because of their attention to personal grooming. According to these accounts, they bathed regularly, combed their hair often, and wore cleaner clothing than many of their neighbours. Whether those writers intended it or not, they painted a surprisingly flattering picture. Imagine launching an invasion and accidentally becoming famous for excellent hair care. History has a peculiar sense of humour. Of course, styles themselves were never identical across the Viking world. Scandinavia stretched across vast distances, and Norse settlements reached from Ireland to Russia and even North America. Hairstyles naturally varied by region, family traditions, personal taste, and changing fashions over generations. There wasn't one official Viking haircut. There were hundreds. What united them wasn't a single style. It was the effort behind it. To the Vikings, taking pride in your appearance wasn't weakness. It was another way of showing discipline, confidence, and self-respect. And sometimes, that first impression could be just as powerful as the sharp edge of an axe. For generations, a Viking's hair helped define who they were. Then a new faith arrived, and with it came new ideas about appearance. The Viking Age was not just a period of raids and exploration. It was also a time of enormous cultural change. Beginning in the late 10th century, more and more Scandinavian rulers embraced Christianity. Kings such as Harald Bluetooth in Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason in Norway encouraged, or sometimes forced, their people to abandon the Old Norse religion. Churches replaced many pagan temples. Crosses appeared where Thor's hammer pendants had once been worn. And slowly, even hairstyles began to reflect a changing world. This did not happen overnight. For decades, perhaps even centuries, old traditions and new customs existed side by side. A farmer might attend a Christian service on Sunday while still following family grooming habits passed down from pagan ancestors. Hair itself did not suddenly become less important. It simply began to symbolize different things. Under Christianity, modesty became a greater virtue than displaying personal glory. Clergymen often wore distinctive hairstyles known as tonsures, with part of the head shaved to symbolize humility and devotion to God. Ordinary Scandinavians did not copy these styles, but the church gradually influenced ideas about appearance, behavior, and respectability. The proud warrior image slowly gave way to a different ideal. Instead of proving yourself through raids, successful Christian kings increasingly emphasized law, order, and stable kingdoms. Looking respectable remained important, but now respect came as much from being a good Christian landowner or merchant as from being a feared warrior. Yet many old habits refused to disappear. Archaeologists continue finding combs, tweezers, and razors in graves dating well into the Christian period. Grooming did not vanish simply because people changed religions. Scandinavians still cared deeply about personal cleanliness, neat hair, and trimmed beards. Some traditions proved stronger than belief itself. Even today, historians sometimes smile at how little changed in everyday life. A man who had proudly combed his beard before honouring Odin often continued combing that same beard after attending church. Old routines have a remarkable way of surviving. Outside Scandinavia, however, the Viking appearance had already become legendary. Across Europe, stories spread of tall northern warriors with striking hair and carefully maintained beards. Over time, those descriptions blended with exaggeration, myth, and imagination. Medieval storytellers added dramatic details. Later artists painted Vikings with flowing hair whipping wildly in the wind. Modern films exaggerated things even further, covering them in dirt while somehow forgetting the comb hanging from their belt. Ironically, the people remembered as Europe's wildest barbarians may have spent more time fixing their hair than many of the people writing about them. Perhaps that is history's greatest joke. The men who terrified kingdoms across Europe also worried about neat beards, clean ears, and whether their comb was packed before leaving home. Sometimes civilization looks different than we expect. If archaeologists had to choose one object that best represents everyday Viking life, most people would expect an axe, or perhaps a sword. Maybe even a helmet, although not one with horns. Instead, one small object keeps appearing again and again: the humble comb. It has been uncovered in trading towns, rural farms, royal halls, fishing villages, burial sites, and Viking settlements stretching from Scandinavia to the British Isles. Wherever the Norse travelled, the comb seemed to travel with them. That alone tells an extraordinary story. Weapons were expensive. Most ordinary Vikings probably owned a spear and a shield rather than a magnificent sword. Jewellery varied depending on wealth. Clothing eventually wore out and disappeared into the soil. But combs survived. And they survived because people valued them enough to carry them everywhere. Many were crafted from antler rather than wood, making them surprisingly durable. Skilled craftsmen carefully cut each tooth by hand before polishing the finished piece until it sat comfortably in the owner's hand. Some combs were beautifully decorated with carved geometric designs, transforming an everyday tool into something worth admiring. Others came with fitted protective cases. Think about that for a moment. Someone cared enough about preserving their comb that they built a special container just to keep it from breaking during travel. That is not the behaviour of people who considered grooming an afterthought. It is the behaviour of people who considered it part of daily life. Even more fascinating, archaeologists often discover combs that have been repaired. Broken teeth were replaced. Cracked sections were reinforced. Instead of throwing them away, their owners fixed them. The comb was not disposable. It was personal. Perhaps it had accompanied its owner across the North Sea, through dangerous storms, busy marketplaces, and family celebrations. Like a trusted knife or favourite drinking horn, it became one of those possessions that quietly followed a person through life. That may explain why combs also appear in Viking graves. Families chose to bury loved ones with items they believed mattered in the next world. Alongside weapons, jewellery, tools, and household goods, combs frequently made the journey as well. Whether intended for practical use after death, or simply as meaningful personal belongings, they remind us that appearance remained important until the very end. Today, the Viking image is changing. The dirty, wild barbarian of old films is slowly giving way to a more accurate picture. Skilled sailors, ambitious traders, capable farmers, talented craftsmen, and disciplined warriors who understood that strength and cleanliness were not opposites. In fact, they often went together. The next time you picture a Viking preparing for a voyage, imagine him fastening his cloak, checking the edge of his axe, adjusting the straps on his shield, and then reaching into a small leather pouch for one final item: his comb. Because to the Vikings, looking your best wasn't vanity, it was another way of showing the world exactly who you were. If you walked through one of the world's first great cities 5,000 years ago, you would probably expect to find temples, markets, workshops, and crowded streets. What you might not expect is to find one of history's earliest organised sex trades. Prostitution is often called the world's oldest profession, but that phrase isn't entirely accurate. People had exchanged sex for gifts, food, or protection long before the first cities ever existed. Hunter-gatherer societies almost certainly had informal relationships that left no written record. but an organized profession, one connected to businesses, laws, taxes, and permanent buildings, required something completely new. It required cities. And the first great cities appeared in Mesopotamia. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, settlements such as Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Babylon grew into bustling urban centres filled with tens of thousands of people. Merchants arrived from distant lands carrying timber, metals, textiles, and precious stones. Soldiers returned from campaigns with wages in their pockets. Labourers crowded the streets after long days digging canals or building temples. Where large numbers of people gathered, businesses quickly followed. Some sold bread, others sold beer, some offered a place to sleep, and eventually some offered sexual services in exchange for payment. To modern ears, the idea of an ancient brothel may sound surprisingly familiar. But in the earliest cities, the system was still evolving. There were no glowing signs outside the door or official business licenses hanging on the wall. Instead, prostitution often existed alongside other commercial activities, especially around taverns, inns, and busy marketplaces where travellers naturally gathered. These establishments became places where strangers met, deals were made, and money changed hands. One common misunderstanding deserves clearing up before we go any further. For centuries, people repeated the story that every woman in Babylon was required to have sex with a stranger at the temple of the goddess Ishtar. Other stories claimed that ancient Mesopotamian temples operated vast networks of sacred prostitutes. These accounts became incredibly popular. The problem is that modern historians and archaeologists increasingly question them. Ancient texts do mention several categories of women connected with temples, but the evidence that they routinely performed sexual services as part of religious rituals is weak and highly debated. Much of the traditional story comes from later Greek writers, particularly Herodotus, whose descriptions cannot always be confirmed by Mesopotamian records. What the surviving evidence does show much more clearly is something different. Commercial prostitution existed as part of urban life. It was recognized by society. It appeared in legal documents. And before long, rulers realized that if prostitution was going to exist anyway, it was better to regulate it than pretend it did not. That decision would shape the history of cities for the next 1,000 years. Once prostitution became part of city life, it did not remain hidden for very long. Like almost everything else in Mesopotamia, it eventually found its way onto clay tablets. The civilizations of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria were obsessed with record-keeping. Scribes carefully documented taxes, property sales, business contracts, marriages, lawsuits, and debts. Their cities ran on written administration, which means that even activities many people preferred not to discuss openly occasionally appeared in official records. That includes prostitution. One of the most revealing sources is the Code of Hammurabi, issued by the Babylonian king Hammurabi around the 18th century before Christ. Interestingly, the law code does not create prostitution or attempt to ban it. Instead, it treats the existence of prostitutes as an accepted fact of urban society. Several laws concern the inheritance rights and property of certain women connected to the profession, showing that at least some could legally own possessions and pass property to relatives. Rather than pretending these women did not exist, Babylonian law acknowledged that they were part of the economic landscape. That tells us something important. When lawmakers begin writing rules about an occupation, it usually means the occupation has become common enough that society must deal with it. But where did these transactions actually happen? Unlike later Roman cities, archaeologists have not uncovered clearly identifiable buildings that can confidently be labelled as brothels. Instead, historians believe much of the trade took place inside taverns, inns, or private houses. The tavern occupied a special place in Mesopotamian life. It served beer, offered food, rented rooms to travellers, and functioned as a social gathering place where merchants, labourers, sailors and visitors mixed together. Unsurprisingly, these establishments also became places where prostitution occurred. For many travellers arriving after weeks on dusty roads or riverboats, the tavern was the first stop in town. Business naturally followed. For generations, another story dominated discussions of ancient Mesopotamia. The idea that temples employed large numbers of sacred prostitutes serving the goddess Ishtar or Inanna. It is certainly a dramatic image. Unfortunately, the evidence is far less dramatic. Modern Assyriologists increasingly argue that the famous stories of widespread temple prostitution rest on misunderstandings of ancient terminology and later Greek accounts rather than clear Mesopotamian evidence. Women associated with temples certainly existed, and some held important religious roles, but that does not automatically mean they provided sexual services as part of worship. The distinction matters. The commercial sex trade of Mesopotamia appears to have been primarily an urban business, not a religious institution. By the time Babylon reached its height, prostitution had become woven into everyday city life, alongside markets, workshops, and taverns. It was neither celebrated nor completely hidden. It simply existed. And as the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean grew wealthier, another society would take this practical approach even further. The Greeks would transform prostitution from an accepted business into something the state itself could organize and profit from. The Babylonians accepted prostitution as part of city life. The Greeks decided something even more unusual. If people were going to pay for sexual services anyway, why shouldn't the state organize the business? Whether every detail is historically accurate remains debated, but ancient Greek writers consistently credited the famous Athenian lawgiver Solon with introducing publicly regulated brothels during the early 6th century before Christ. It was a remarkably practical solution. Athens was changing rapidly. Trade was expanding across the Aegean Sea. Merchants, sailors, craftsmen and labourers poured into the city looking for work and opportunity. Like every growing port, Athens attracted thousands of young men living far from their families. Demand existed. The question was how the city should respond. According to later Greek tradition, Solon chose regulation over prohibition. Public brothels, known as dicteria, supposedly offered inexpensive services at fixed prices. The state collected revenue while keeping the business concentrated in specific locations, rather than allowing it to spread unpredictably through the city. To modern ears, it sounds surprisingly bureaucratic. Even ancient vice, it seems, eventually found its paperwork. These establishments were not luxurious, far from it. Most were simple buildings divided into small rooms with little decoration. Their customers were generally ordinary working men, sailors returning from long voyages, craftsmen finishing a day's labour, visiting traders or travellers passing through Athens. Prices were intentionally low, making the services available to people who could never afford the company of wealthy courtesans. But Greek prostitution was far from a single profession. In fact, it existed in distinct social layers. At the lower end were women working in brothels, many of whom had been enslaved or were under the control of brothel owners. They possessed few legal rights and had little control over their own lives. At the opposite end stood the hetairai. These women occupied an entirely different world. Unlike ordinary prostitutes, many hetairai were educated, independent and highly accomplished conversationalists. They attended banquets alongside philosophers, politicians, poets and generals. Some became enormously wealthy and influential, forming long-term relationships with powerful men rather than serving large numbers of clients. Beauty alone was not enough. A successful hetera might speak several languages, play musical instruments, quote poetry, debate politics, and discuss philosophy with some of the brightest minds in Greece. In many respects, they resembled elite companions far more than the occupants of ordinary brothels. This sharp division reveals something fascinating about Greek society. The Athenians often condemned excessive desire in philosophy and public speeches. Yet at the same time, they created one of the ancient world's most organized systems of commercial sex. Morality and practicality rarely marched in perfect step. Athens openly regulated a business many citizens preferred not to discuss at home. And while the Greeks had made prostitution into an organized civic institution, another civilization would expand the system even further. The Romans would regulate it, register it, tax it, and turn it into another ordinary profession within one of history's greatest empires. If the Greeks organized prostitution, the Romans turned it into an industry. By the height of the Roman Empire, prostitution was no longer simply tolerated. It was regulated, taxed, recorded, and woven into the daily life of nearly every major city. Rome was unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. At its peak, the capital may have held more than 1 million inhabitants. Every day, merchants unloaded cargo from across the Mediterranean. Soldiers returned from distant frontiers. Sailors, slaves, craftsmen, politicians, entertainers, and travellers crowded the streets together. Where people gathered in such enormous numbers, demand inevitably followed. The Roman government understood a simple reality. Prostitution was not going to disappear. So rather than outlaw it, officials decided to supervise it. Women who worked as prostitutes were expected to register with the authorities, officially declaring their profession. Once registered, the status was difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. Even if a woman later left the trade, Roman law often continued to identify her by that legal classification. It was a profession recognized by the state, but it also carried lasting social consequences. The government even collected taxes from prostitution. By the early imperial period, emperors recognized it as another source of public revenue. The same state that built roads, aqueducts, and amphitheatres also profited from one of its oldest businesses. Practicality often outweighed moral discomfort. Nowhere can we see this system more clearly than in Pompeii. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, volcanic ash buried the city so quickly that entire buildings remained astonishingly well preserved. Among them stands one of history's most famous brothels, known today simply as the Lupanar. Walking through its narrow entrance today feels almost like stepping into Roman daily life. The building contained a series of tiny rooms, each holding little more than a stone bed topped with what would once have been a mattress. Privacy was limited. Luxury was almost non-existent. These were functional spaces designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Above several doorways are small frescoes depicting erotic scenes. For many years, historians debated their purpose. Some believe they advertised the services available inside, perhaps serving as a visual menu for customers who spoke different languages or could not read. Others argue they were simply decorative. Whatever their exact function, they remind us that Roman brothels operated openly enough to display such artwork without embarrassment. Outside, life continued as normal. People bought bread, visited baths, attended the theatre, stopped at taverns, and some visited the brothel. To many Romans, it was simply another business on the street. Respected citizens rarely boasted about visiting such places, yet few pretended they did not exist. Roman society drew a careful distinction between accepting prostitution as a public institution and granting prostitutes social respect. The business itself was legal. The stigma remained. It was a contradiction the Romans lived with every day, and one that reveals as much about their society as their laws ever could. Rome had perfected the business, but that did not mean it respected the people who worked in it. This was one of the great contradictions of the ancient world. Governments licensed prostitution. Officials collected taxes from it. Cities provided places where it could operate openly. Yet the men and women involved often occupied the very bottom of society's social ladder. The reality was far more complicated than many people imagine. Not everyone entered prostitution for the same reason. Many women working in Roman brothels were enslaved. Their owners controlled where they lived, how they worked, and who received the money they earned. They possessed little freedom, and their daily lives were shaped almost entirely by the decisions of someone else. Others, however, were freed women or independent workers. Some rented rooms, some worked from taverns or private houses, others operated without a brothel owner altogether, arranging their own clients and keeping a larger share of their earnings. Their experiences could differ enormously. At the very top were elite courtesans. Like the Greek hetairai before them, these women often served wealthy patrons rather than large numbers of ordinary customers. Beauty certainly mattered, but conversation, education, wit, and social skills could be equally valuable. Some became financially successful, owned property, and moved comfortably among Rome's upper classes, even if respectable society never fully accepted them. Meanwhile, ordinary brothels served a very different clientele. Most customers were not senators or famous generals. They were craftsmen, finishing work for the day. Sailors, whose ships had just entered port. Travelling merchants. Soldiers on leave. Young, unmarried men. For many, a visit required little planning. Brothels were often located near markets, bathhouses, taverns, theatres, or busy streets where foot traffic remained constant. They were neither hidden deep underground nor placed in luxurious neighbourhoods. They simply existed alongside other urban businesses. Finding one was rarely difficult. Some establishments displayed small lamps or painted signs outside. Others relied on word of mouth or their familiar location within the city. Pompeii even preserves graffiti scratched into walls, some advertising services, others reviewing experiences with surprising honesty. Apparently, online customer reviews existed nearly 2,000 years before the internet. Only the spelling was worse. Clothing also reflected legal and social distinctions. Roman writers occasionally mention prostitutes wearing garments that separated them from respectable married women, although exactly how consistently these customs were enforced remains debated. More important than clothing was reputation. Once someone became publicly known as a prostitute, escaping that identity proved extraordinarily difficult. Marriage prospects declined. Social standing suffered. Respectability became almost impossible to recover. That contrast reveals the Roman attitude perfectly. The profession itself was legal. Society depended upon it. The government earned money from it. Yet those performing the work remained permanently marked by it. It was a system built not on equality, but on contradiction. And that contradiction would leave a lasting legacy far beyond the fall of Rome itself. By the time the Roman Empire reached its height, organised prostitution had existed for thousands of years. It had survived the rise and fall of kingdoms. It had crossed languages, religions, and cultures. And although Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome each approached it differently, they all arrived at remarkably similar conclusions. People would always seek sexual services. Governments could either ignore that reality or regulate it. That decision shaped cities in ways that extended far beyond the walls of any brothel. The earliest urban civilizations had discovered something every growing city eventually faced. When thousands of strangers lived together, entirely new businesses emerged. Bakers fed them. Brewers supplied them with beer and wine. Innkeepers rented them beds, and prostitution became another service woven into the economy. It was not simply about sex, it was about commerce. The Mesopotamians treated it as part of everyday urban life, recording it in legal documents alongside property and inheritance. The Greeks experimented with public regulation, at least according to long-standing tradition, making prostitution part of civic administration. The Romans expanded the system even further, licensing workers, collecting taxes, and integrating brothels into the ordinary rhythm of city life. Each civilization reflected its own values. Yet all three reveal the same lesson. Ancient governments were often far more practical than idealistic. Rather than asking whether prostitution should exist, they usually asked how it could be managed. That does not mean life inside these institutions was easy. Far from it. For many enslaved women, brothels represented lives with little freedom and few choices. Others managed to gain independence, while a small number of elite courtesans achieved wealth, education, and influence that many respectable women could never hope to obtain. There was no single story. Only countless individual lives shaped by circumstances that differed enormously. That complexity is often lost in popular culture. Modern films tend to portray ancient brothels as glamorous places, filled with luxury and constant celebration, or, at the opposite extreme, as dark buildings occupied entirely by criminals. Archaeology paints a quieter picture. Most brothels were surprisingly ordinary. Small rooms, simple furniture, busy streets outside, people coming and going as they did at taverns, bathhouses, markets, and workshops. They were businesses. Nothing more mysterious than that. Perhaps the greatest surprise is not that prostitution existed. It is how openly ancient societies discussed it. Roman officials taxed it. Greek writers joked about it. Babylonian law acknowledged it. Instead of pretending it did not exist, these civilizations folded it into their legal and economic systems, even while maintaining powerful social stigmas against many of the people involved. That contradiction has echoed through history ever since. The world's first brothels were never simply places where people bought intimacy. They were mirrors reflecting the cities that built them, revealing how ancient societies balanced morality with practicality, law with commerce, and public order with the complicated realities of human nature.